Good morning to everyone. I invite you to turn to Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. So good to see everybody on this beautiful but blustery Lord's Day morning. I'm going to begin a short series today that I'm calling Leadership on the High Seas. Spiritual leadership is something that is greatly needed in the Lord's church. And in the 27th chapter of the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul is in chains. Paul has been arrested. He has been taken to Caesarea for trial. He has been kept there in custody for 2 long years. You remember that he was put on trial before Felix, then before Festus, and then before Herod Agrippa II. It was before Festus that Paul had directly appealed to Caesar, which was his right as a Roman citizen. And so now he had to be sent to Rome. That's the historical context at the beginning of Acts chapter 27. And here we find Luke beginning to write in the first person, suggesting to us that he had been permitted to go along as Paul's companion on the journey to Rome. And how wonderful it would be for Paul to have his friend, who was also a physician, along with him on this trip. What Luke writes here is his first-hand testimony. It's an inspired eyewitness chronicle of the events that occurred. And this chapter of Acts is said by some scholars to contain more information about ancient seafaring than virtually any other first century source. Now, our primary focus, however, is going to be on the leadership that Paul exhibited and that Luke saw firsthand. And despite these circumstances, he exhibits tremendous leadership that really stands out, really rises to the top, to the surface in these verses. You remember that Paul said in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 16, "Wherefore I beseech you, be ye followers of me." And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and 1, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." Paul was an example of a true Christ-like leader. A real leader is an example to follow. And the best example to follow, as Paul knew, is the example of Jesus Christ. So when we study Paul as an example of leadership, we are in fact helping ourselves be what we ought to be. Paul's leadership was manifested in the most unlikely of circumstances. In a shipwreck where he was the lowest ranking person on board ship. And yet he would rise to the occasion and he would demonstrate extraordinary powers of leadership. So in this chapter, we see a number of biblical principles of leadership. And as we begin our study of this chapter today, I want us to focus upon 3 of them. Number 1, a leader is trustworthy. A leader is trustworthy. Now, if you have your Bibles, and you have them open to Acts chapter 27, let's read together verses 1 through 3, all right? Acts 27, beginning in verse 1. "And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. So we read here that Julius the centurion was in charge of this delegation of prisoners. And like Cornelius that we read about in Acts 10, this man was an illustrious centurion. It says he belonged to the Augustan band. And that enjoyed great prestige in that age because that band was named in honor of the emperor, Caesar Augustus. Paul's trip to Rome was made in 3 different ships. Sometimes you might go overseas and you might have to change planes 2 or 3 times. He had to change ships 3 different times. The one belonging to Adramyttium, a city on the Aegean coastline and in the western Asia Minor, was the first of the 3, and its destination was not Rome, it was going home. And the centurion doubtless expected to contact another ship along the Aegean coastline en route to Rome, and so they put to sea in the ship. Verse 3, and the next day we touched at Sidon. And Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. You know, I sort of find it interesting that when you read about different centurions in the New Testament, it's nearly always favorable. And here you have another one. The scriptures give a very favorable view of Julius. And Luke doesn't tell us what caused the centurion to show courtesy to Paul on this occasion, but at Sidon, their first stop, the Apostle Paul was allowed to go ashore and visit friends and refresh himself. And what a relief this must have been to him. Keep in mind again, he has been in custody in Caesarea, locked up for 2 whole years. And when I looked up this Greek word for refresh himself, I found out that was a medical term. And it could be translated as receive care. So Julius granted Paul shore leave to be cared for by his friends. Now, isn't that unusual? You don't just give that kind of prisoner liberty without a good reason. If a Roman soldier ever lost a prisoner because of negligence, you know what the penalty was? Death. He paid for it with his life. And yet here is Julius, and he gives Paul permission to visit friends in Sidon and receive care from them. Why did he do that? Well, it's obvious to me that he trusted Paul. And somehow, either while still a prisoner at Caesarea or in that one day's journey, Paul had caused that centurion to believe that Paul would never do anything that would cost that centurion personally. And maybe Governor Festus, who knew Paul's assurance, had assured Julius that Paul could be trusted and ordered him to treat him courteously. Because turn back to Acts chapter 24 in verse 23. And here you have mention of a centurion, but he's not named. So we're just wondering if this could be him. But in Acts 24:23, and he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. Well, that's sort of what happens here, isn't it? So perhaps that was Julius on that occasion. But all of this evidence amounts to the fact Paul had earned a reputation of trust. They believed that Paul could be trusted. The 34th President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, once said, "The supreme quality of leadership is unquestionably integrity. Without it, no real success is possible, no matter whether it is on a section gang, a football field, in an army, or in an office." Well, as a leader, Julius realized that Paul was a person of integrity, of honesty. He saw him as a trustworthy person, even though he was a prisoner. How does a leader build trust? A leader is not somebody who is consumed with his own success, consumed with his own best interest. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but let in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look, not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. A true leader is someone who demonstrates to everyone around him that their interests are what occupies their heart. Go back to Acts chapter 16 for a moment, beginning in verse 27. You remember back in Acts 16 when Paul and Silas were in the Philippian jail? And they had an earthquake. An earthquake opened up all the doors so all the prisoners could get out. In Acts 16:27, the keeper of the prison, awaking out of his sleep, and seeing the prison doors open, he drew out his sword and would have killed himself, supposing that the prisoners had been fled. But Paul cried with a loud voice, saying, do thyself no harm, for we are all here. You hear his concern for this jailer who is about to throw himself on the point of his sword? And that jailer learned that Paul was a trustworthy leader. And that no doubt helped to lead to his conversion to Christ and his household at the end of that chapter. Nothing can take the place of trust. A leader that you can't trust is no leader at all. Trust stems from the selfless way that the godly leader uses his own energies and abilities sacrificially. If you show people you truly have their best interest at heart, then they will follow you. Julius was so convinced that Paul would never do anything to bring harm to him that he let him go ashore and visit his friends. And of course, Paul came back, didn't he? He proved himself worthy of Julius's trust. And Paul was thereby building more trust that would further strengthen his own hand for leadership later in the journey. All right, second of all, when I think about principles of leadership as exemplified in the Apostle Paul in these unusual circumstances, I think about the fact, secondly, that a leader takes the initiative. A leader takes the initiative. This is the second leadership principle that stands out to me in this chapter. Let's read now verses 4 through 7. And when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria, sailing into Italy. And he put us thereon. When we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salome. So here's ship number 2 of Paul's voyage. This ship is from Alexandria in Egypt, and it's sailing to Italy. Well, that's their destination. So they thought this would be their last ship. The second ship would be their last one. And we're going to read in verse 38 now that this ship was hauling wheat. The fruitful Nile Valley made Egypt a great source of grain. And I've read that there were not many passenger ships in that day. And so passengers from all ranks of society, they would have to ride the merchant ships. And this ship was a very large one, carrying 276 passengers on board, according to verse 37. Including the prisoners that they transported. So they board this Alexandrian ship to the east of a direct line to Italy, but we see the ship sailed almost due south for about 100 miles before reaching the open seas, and it took them many days to cover the distance that favorable winds would have carried them in one day. They sailed under Crete against the lee or the shelter of Crete, trying to let the island shelter them from the wind. Picking up now in verse 8. And hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens. Now whereunto was the city of Lasea. Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. Right here is the second foundational principle of true leadership. A leader takes the initiative. You've got a ship that's loaded with many powerful men. Think about it. You've got the captain, you have the pilot, you have the sailors, you have the centurion, you have all these Roman soldiers, and you know for sure that every one of them had a strong opinion about whether or not to leave Fair Havens. And you can be sure they were all talking about it. Much was at stake for all of them, but it is Paul, the prisoner, who seizes the initiative and speaks out. He recognized the danger, and he points it out clearly. He had no rank, he had no title, he had no authority among them, but he realized there is a problem here. And so he took the initiative, and that's leadership. Leaders rise in times of crisis by taking the initiative. A leader never says, well, we might have a problem over here and somebody ought to do something about it. A leader says, here's the problem and here's how to solve it. Consider a Bible illustration of that. You know, some time ago we studied the fascinating book of Nehemiah together, and I really enjoyed that study. And Nehemiah single-handedly united the people of Jerusalem, and he helped to rebuild the walls of the city in 52 days' time. And it was one of the most remarkable displays of strategic initiative and courageous leadership ever recorded in history. Nehemiah took the initiative to ask about how the people were doing back home. In Nehemiah 1 and verse 2, that Hananiah, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And this was the motivation that led Nehemiah, the king's cupbearer, to become a leader in the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem. He was not concerned with himself. He was not concerned about the cushy job that he had as the king's cupbearer. He was concerned with God's honor. He was the king's cupbearer. He was well situated. He could have said, well, I wish those people would do something about that. That's ridiculous. No. Instead, he took the initiative to pray about it. We read about his great prayer there. And then he approached the king with a plan. And he took the initiative to seek to influence the king. And he was relentless. And he was dedicated to the work. And the people of Jerusalem followed his lead against ridicule and against conspiracy and against discouragement, deceit, and every form of vicious opposition. And in spite of all of that, and because of the initiative of this one man, Nehemiah 6:15 says, so the wall was finished in the 20 and 5th day of the month Elul in 52 days. So I think about Nehemiah, and I think about how Nehemiah was a lot like Paul. He was not afraid to take the initiative. And it's the responsibility of elders and deacons and preachers and teachers and every member to change the hearts of people through their influence, as John's been talking about in his class, and to lead them to accept their plans in building up the church and carrying the gospel to a world that is lost. A leader takes the initiative. And then third, a leader uses good judgment. A leader uses good judgment. The sailors and the soldiers discussed Paul's advice. Good judgment. And they decided to reject it. Picking up now in verse 11, would you read with me? Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship, more than those things which were spoken by Paul, and because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they may attain to Phoenicia and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete, and lie toward the southwest and northwest. So the centurion had to decide whether he was going to winter there at Fair Havens or set sail and try to reach the port of Phoenix on the southern coast of Crete. This was about 40 miles away. And they must have thought, well, who is Paul? What does he know to advise us sailors with all of our experience? Why, he's just a prisoner. Why should we listen to him? And so Julius chose to listen to the expert advice of the pilot and of the captain, the master and the owner of the ship. And the more part, it says, also wanted to leave, since Fair Havens was not a very comfortable place, to settle down for the winter, because it was too open to winter storms. Phoenix had a much more sheltered harbor, so we read that Julius rejected the wise counsel of Paul for the will of the majority. How often have people been willing to listen to the majority, and how often have they followed poor advice to their own destruction, to their own detriment? Solomon says in Proverbs 1:5, a wise man will hear and will increase learning. A man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. But in Proverbs 12:15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. We need to listen to wise counsel. You think about Aaron. Now, Aaron was a leader, but Aaron listened to unwise counsel of the multitude there at Sinai, and what did he do? He built an idol. He built the golden calf in Exodus 32:1. You think about Rehoboam. Rehoboam rejected the wise counsel of the old men, and he took the counsel of the young men, and that unwise counsel led to the division of the kingdom of Israel in 1 Kings chapter 12. The law plainly said, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, in Exodus 32 and verse 2. But the centurion followed the majority rule to lead the ship right into the storm, and Paul's wise counsel was shunned. His advice, it was good judgment, but by rejecting it, the crew and the soldiers, they were gambling everybody's lives. There was a lot in jeopardy with this decision to sail. The cargo, the ship, and the lives of everybody on board could be lost. And that's just how Paul outlined the danger there in verse 10. Now in verses 13, and we'll conclude today in verse 15. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. Well, that south wind blew softly, and they thought, well, we're just as good as there. Oh, this is great. With that encouraging change in the weather, they thought they had just what they needed. And as the ship left harbor, perhaps Julius and the pilot and the captain are saying to Paul, see, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. And they assumed that the soft wind and the smooth seas would allow them to continue their journey right on to Rome. And it was not long at all until Paul's judgment was proved right, because that soft wind became a stormy wind. And the word translated tempestuous gives us the English word typhoon. And sailors called this special wind Euroclydon, which means a northeaster. And this violent storm lasted 14 days, and the crew had no choice but to let the ship drift with the wind, because it was impossible to steer it. Let me ask you something, and I hope this is not the case, but have you ever been in a vehicle that was out of control? I have. And it was no fun experience. I had preached at Reelfoot Lake in Sandburg one Sunday, and I was driving back Sunday night, and it was dark, and it was late. And I was on that curvy road from Hornbeak to Troy, and I was just about to come into Troy. And there's a little curve there, and you go over this little hill, and I went around the curve, went over this little hill, and I hit this big black dog. And it threw my car, and my car went out of control, and I took a nosedive into a ditch, came out of the ditch, and was headed straight to the corner of a brick house. Whereupon I fought with all my life that steering wheel and was able to turn that car around to keep from hitting that house. Well, I want to tell you, I was thinking about that when I was looking at this morning. There was a point there on the road after I hit that dog that I had to let my car drive. I was not in control of that car anymore. That car was in control of me. And I thought about that when I was reading that this morning. They let the ship drive. That meant they were not in control of the ship. The ship was in control of them. And that wind drove the ship 23 miles to the south to the island of Claudia. There have been times when false teaching has been taught in the church. I heard about a Christian couple that reported to a fellow preacher that a certain professor had visited their congregation where they were members. And he had sat down with the elders and other interested members to advise them how to introduce choirs and special music into the worship assembly. And he said, quote, "Many churches are uncomfortable with anything new or different in worship, and thus you have to do it very slowly in introducing the idea that change is attractive as long as it's not wrenching. If it's wrenching, you back off slowly and you try it again later." Well, didn't Paul warn in Ephesians 4:14 that ye be henceforth no more children, tossed to and fro, carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive, but speaking the truth in love may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ. There are winds of false doctrine blowing through. At times they blow slowly. People don't listen to the warnings from church leaders with good judgment, but they insist, well, these winds and these smooth seas will carry the church in the direction that we want to go. So don't make waves, don't rock the boat. And some refuse to stand up for what they know is right because they think somebody else will look down on them. And as a result, they are led by those who by smooth and fair speech beguile the hearts of the innocent. Romans 16 and verse 18. Those kind of winds eventually blow the church in many places off course. It's very important that leaders have good judgment. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 9, holding fast the faithful word as they have been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers. Our generation faces tremendous challenges, and all of us should work on improving our leadership skills. This is one of the greatest needs in the church. Somebody said, I can better relate to these leadership principles when I see them exemplified in the lives of real people. Well, in the study of Acts chapter 27, that's what we're doing. We need leaders like Paul. Leaders who are trustworthy, leaders who take the initiative, leaders who use good judgment. If you're not a member of the Church of Christ today and you wish to become one, it takes faith in Christ who died on Calvary's cross to set us free from sin. It takes repentance of our sins, Luke 13:3. And it takes baptism for the remission of sins, Acts 2 and 38. That'll make you a child of God, a member of the church. If you need to come repenting of public sin, we'd love to pray with you and for you. Won't you come together, we stand and sing.